are listening to the Thornapple Valley Church podcast. Thank you for joining us. Our hope is for you to be encouraged and to connect with God during this message. If you'd like to know more about Thornapple Valley Church, visit tvcweb.com.
I'm back! So I actually never really left, but for a few weeks I was at our Delton campus speaking live, and then I was also at our Middleville campus. So glad to be back speaking with you guys as we're in this series, Chasing the Wind. If you got a Bible or a Bible app today, we're going to be in Ecclesiastes chapter 4. So Ecclesiastes chapter 4. But while you're getting there, so I've been here about 7-8 weeks. People keep asking me, how are your family starting to settle and fit in? And so the other day I was telling our Delton campus is that my 10-year-old son came back home after his first day of school. And I said, son, how was your first day of school? He said, well, I got a girlfriend on the first day. So I was like, well, I guess that's a good day. I don't know, So it's one of those deals where he gets his looks from his mom, but he's starting to feel really good and fitting in. But today, what I want to talk to you about is I want to talk to you about this concept of real connection and community. This whole subject, chasing the wind, this whole concept that's in the book of Ecclesiastes, I think it's one that we can all relate to both practically, but also in the sense of the metaphor because, I want you to imagine, take you back to elementary school, right? You're in the 5th grade. It's been cold. Every day you got to get up and you got to wear your thermals and you got all of this stuff. And then all of a sudden the spring comes. The wind starts to blow. You got that brand new kite and you are chasing the wind literally so you can fly your kite. Here's the only problem. The wind is unpredictable. It's unstable, so you don't know how long you're going to be able to fly the kite. And then at the same time, it's kind of exhausting. Because you spend your time kind of waiting, okay, here's the wind, go, I can fly my kite. And so you fly it, and then all of a sudden it dies down, and so it's unpredictable, it's unstable, and it's exhausting. And honestly, I think that's how some of us feel in life right now. We're chasing a lot of stuff, but we feel exhausted because we're waiting on the stock market to get better. We're waiting on inflation to go down. We're just chasing the wind. Today we're going to talk about this idea about relationships and community. Here's where we've been in this series. So in week 1, we said that we believe the person who wrote the book of Ecclesiastes is a guy by the name of Solomon. Now Solomon, as he starts off writing this book, one of his themes is meaningless. He says it's all not really satisfying. It's not leading to the kind of life I want to live. And so he first starts off by describing his own experimentation. In chapter 1, he talks about the meaninglessness of just getting knowledge. In chapter 2, he talks about the meaninglessness of just going after pleasure. But in chapter 3, Jeff was here and he talked to us about this idea where Solomon's going to move from just experimentation to observation. And Jeff talked to us about the meaninglessness of fighting against the divine seasons of life. There's a time to rest, there's a time to work. There's a time to rest, there's a time to work. And today he's going to talk about the meaninglessness of living life alone. When I think about community and being connected in community, I think sometimes the reason we don't connect with community is because sometimes church people can be weird. We really can. We're imperfect people, and I'm one of those imperfect people. I recently heard the story about this young pastor. He steps into this new church, and he wants to be creative, dynamic, and innovative, and so he wants to raise money for a new youth center. So instead of doing the typical 3-year pledges, what he says is, we're going to try something new. He says, the first 3 people who give me $1,000, I will let you pick the next 3 hymns for next week. So I don't know if you've ever tried something new and innovative. You don't know if it's going to work. And so I imagine this guy's got a little bit of energy and nervousness, and so he throws it out. But to his surprise, before he finished talking, a lady walks up, an elderly lady, and she hands him $1,000. He thinks to himself, this is working. So he says, all right, well, Miss Elsie Mae, you can now pick the next 3 hymns for next Sunday. And she walks to the front row, and she says, I want him, and I want him. Anyway. Oh, man. So you got to try being up here one time because some people are like, dude, that is funny. Other people are like, is he really the preacher here? Anyway, here's the truth. Sometimes, even though we as church people can be difficult, we can be awkward, here's my premise today. We need each other. I need people like you in my life. And I would go so far to say you need people like me. I'm imperfect. I don't always say everything right. I don't always do everything right. But we need each other on this journey towards living a life of maturity, of meaning, and really being the person that God's called us to be. Here's how Solomon, we believe this is Solomon. We can't know for sure how he writes it in Ecclesiastes chapter 4, I'm starting verse 8. He said, there was a man all alone. He had neither son or brother. There was no end to his toil, yet his eyes were not content with his wealth. Now, Solomon's saying, take it from me. I saw a guy who was living the American dream. He was free, but he wasn't free. He didn't have any responsibilities, nobody that he had to look out for, and yet at the same time, this guy who has neither son nor brother, the assumption is that he doesn't have a wife, he doesn't have others. He's just living his life, yet he was not content with his wealth. Which is something that kind of strikes at the heart of our whole marketing campaign, because what marketing says is if you have this, you'll be happy. Get a faster boat, get a bigger house. You are going to be happy when you get to the American dream. He's living the American dream, but he's not satisfied. And so it goes on to say this. His eyes were not, I'm still in verse 8, his eyes were not content with his wealth. For whom am I toiling? He asked. Why am I depriving myself of enjoyment? Here's a guy who's working himself into the grave, and at some point he just says, why am I like a hamster on a wheel? I'm pushing, I'm trying, I'm striving, and then I make the money, but yet at the same time, I don't have some of the pressures that other people have, but yet at the same time, I don't have the connection that I genuinely long for. With more money came more misery. And with no connection came sadness and pain. He goes on to say, this too is meaningless, a miserable business. Now, here's why I believe that Solomon is not talking about himself. If this is Solomon who writes this, is because we know that these things are not true about Solomon. He's not all alone. He has 1,000 wives. There are 700 wives, 300 concubines. He also has many brothers because David, who married multiple wives, so he had all kind of half brothers and sisters. And he definitely had a son who will actually inherit the throne from him. But here's this guy who's got a thriving business, but he called it a miserable business. I wonder how many of you are sitting here right now and you feel like you're thriving in your career, but you're miserable on the inside. And when you come over to the Thanksgiving, everybody sees the car you drive in and all your little nieces and nephews. You're like, I want to be just like you, Uncle Bob. I want to be just like you, Uncle Ray. And there's something on the inside of you that says, no, you don't. You don't. Because there's misery in this success that I have, and I don't even know what's missing. He goes on to say this in verse 9. Two are better than one, because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. Also, if two lie together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. So it's kind of interesting as you read this book. It's a very sober book. It's a very thoughtful book. Oftentimes, as the writer is writing, which we believe to be Solomon, he will state a problem, but he doesn't give it the answer. In this passage, he does. He says, there's a guy who's all alone. He's doing life by himself, and he's miserable. So he says, here's the solution, is deep connections, real connections. He says, 2 are better than 1. In modern day language, he says, this guy needs people in his life. Because success in and of itself does not just satisfy. Now, this is something that I know to be true myself, because I can remember when I first started in ministry, so 22 years ago. I'm young, I'm in my early 20s, and I remember I got hired at a church that grew by literally 1,000% the first year. They grew from 0 to 1,000. I got hired on the second year, they grew from 1,000 to 2,500. So I'm at this church and I'm thinking, man, this is exciting. Imagine going to a church where every single week we're bringing in more chairs, and there was excitement and growth. And we bought the biggest piece of property in the entire city of Arlington. It was a moment, it was exciting. But honestly, if I'm just being honest with you, I felt miserable. Because we were just constantly working. And even though we were living for God, it kind of felt like success was our God. And I can remember in the middle of that, just kind of thinking to myself, I'm in my early 20s, I'm single, I'm thinking, at this rate, I'm never going to get married, never going to have kids. I don't know if this is worth it. So I remember taking a courageous step to start trying to find another job. I was in youth ministry at the time. And I heard about this church in Three Rivers, Michigan. Now, at that time, living in Dallas-Fort Worth, I had never heard of Three Rivers, Michigan. I couldn't even find Three Rivers, Michigan on the map. And there's this pastor who is going to invite me up to interview. So I remember at that time, I flew into Chicago. Now, as a guy from the South, Chicago was so cold. It was so cold, I thought, God, you don't love these people that you would make them this cold. But yet at the same time, the people at this church, they love God, they love the mission, and they felt like family. And I can remember, I'm young, I'm on the plane back, and I thought, this is where I need to be. And I remember landing back in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and then I remember my senior pastor at the time pulling me in the office, and he said, Keith Brown, I don't want to lose you. I will pay you, I will give you a raise to stay, I will give you more authority, I will give you more power. And I'm telling you, I remember going back to, I was living in a one-bedroom apartment at the time, and I remember praying, seeking God. Because there's part of me that said, you want that. You're in your early 20s. Dude, you're going to be on a cover of Charisma magazine, which some of you are like, what is Charisma magazine? Exactly my point. So it's kind of one of those things where you're going places. But then there was another part of me that said, are you going the kind of place where you really want to be? See, here's what I think this morning. For some of you, this is a wake-up call. You're heading in the direction of your dreams, but you're realizing that the dreams you're heading towards is actually a nightmare. And I can remember making the decision. I said to my senior pastor, no, I'm going to take this job in Michigan. I move up to Michigan, and for the first little bit, it was hard. It was difficult. I had to adjust. But at that church, I met my wife. I had my first 2 kids there. I'm so grateful that I made that decision, but I had to choose something that was not easy. But yet at the same time, it was better. This is what Solomon is trying to grab the attention. This guy who's been toiling and toiling and toiling, he finally has a wake-up moment and he says, what am I doing this for? See, here's what the writer of Ecclesiastes is trying to help us to see, is when we don't have community, here's the first thing I want you to write down if you're taking notes, it makes work harder. It makes work harder. Now, I believe in hard work. I'm a type A personality. I love working hard. I'm the kind of guy who want to get there early, leave late. But when you are working in a dysfunctional and a toxic environment, it's tough. And see, I've done that in church world. And so I said to myself as a young leader, as I progress through the different levels of leadership, that's not the environment that I want to be in. I want to be in a place that's fun. So let me just tell you a little bit about our staff here. We're not perfect. We make mistakes. But we are one of the most fun staffs in the country. I'm telling you, we have all kind of fun. The other week, we had these little plastic cockroaches, and we were putting them in people's houses, and in people, well, not in people's houses, but in people's offices, and it was just fun. And some of you are like, why do I give to a church where you guys are playing around with plastic cockroaches? I don't know. I mean, you do it. But anyway, the point of the matter is that we have fun. We work hard. Easter, we had a great Easter. Following Easter, we had baptism. We had over 80 people get baptized. That's why you see the names on the cross over here. Yeah, you can celebrate that. But after that, our entire staff, we went down to Atlanta to a conference, and we just had so much fun. Here's a couple pictures from our trip to Atlanta. This is our whole group there, and then here's another just picture of some of us on the train. It was just so fun to be connected, because life is too short to live miserable. And when you have real community where you're connected, we don't always see eye to eye, but we love each other, and we're doing the journey of life together. But here's what I think. Many times what stops us from really deeply connecting with people and church people is because we have wrong assumptions about church people. We think that if I'm going to be around church people, then they should always do everything right. Anytime a church person swears, oh man, which by the way, if that's a concern for you, this is not the church to be a part of, because we got everyday people here. But every time somebody messes up and they fall down, then, that's not the kind of church I want to be a part of. You're missing out. During the World War II time, there was a German theologian by the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer once said this in his classic book, Life Together. He said, those who love their dream of Christian community more than Christian community itself become destroyers of that Christian community, even though their intentions may be ever honest, earnest, and sincere. Think about that for a second. He says, those who love their dream of Christian community more than community itself, they actually destroy the very thing that they dream of. Because here's what church is about: real people on a real journey. We're getting better together. We grow together. We cry together. We make mistakes together, but we're getting better together. Here's the second truth that if we go back to the text, what I believe that the writer of Ecclesiastes is saying, once you get down to verse 10, he says that those who don't have community, it makes failure harder. It makes failure harder. In verse 10, he says, pity anyone who does not have someone to help them when they fall. Let me just tell you a truth about life and a truth about the spiritual journey of life. I wish I could tell you that it goes like this. The moment you choose to follow Jesus, it's just up and to the right. Everything that you do, man, you just start reading your Bible. You start coming to church, and you're like, man, I'm coming to church every week. We got this new pastor. I mean, he's so funny and dynamic and cool, and I just love hanging out with him. Man, I'm telling you, I'm going to be there every single week. I'm going to read my Bible. I'm going to grow, and I'm going to keep on making progress, and I just keep going up like this, but it doesn't work that way. Here's what happens. I would imagine for many of you, I look around the room, and I personally had the opportunity to baptize many of you. Here's what happened. You got baptized, and you had a great week, and then all of a sudden, something happened, and you did this. And you thought to yourself, I thought I had a spiritual experience. I thought that was real. I can remember going into the water of baptism, and I remember when the pastor said to me, he said, hey, do you choose to follow Jesus, and will you, to the best of your intention, obey everything that he came in? And I really meant it. And I went under those waters, and I felt new, but I still struggle with this old stuff. The spiritual life goes like this. And he says, I pity the person who doesn't have anybody to help them when they fall. Because here's the truth about failure, is failure hurts. It hurts. And if you imagine, like, as you're walking and there's a pit hole and you don't even see that pit hole and you fall into that hole, oftentimes you physically get injured and you can't pull yourself up. But here's what some of us do, is we try to limp along and try to fake it and act like we got it together and act like we don't need anybody, where the truth of the matter is, I started off like this. I need people like you, and you need people like me. Imperfect people who are trying our best to get better on the journey. There's a story in John chapter 8. I won't have you turn there. And it's about Jesus. But it's more about Jesus' reaction to people when they mess up. In John chapter 8, Jesus is writing on the ground, and these religious zealots are going to come up to Jesus, and they're going to come up. Well, let me just tell you this first. This story I'm about to tell you, it is one of the most disgusting stories in the Bible. And you're going to understand what I mean in a moment. So, there's a woman who's caught in the act of adultery, and they bring her to Jesus. Now, they don't bring her to Jesus because they want Jesus to show love and grace and kindness to her. They bring her to Jesus to make a point. That's why I told you this story is disgusting. So they bring her to Jesus, and can you imagine the shame, the guilt, the awkwardness, the uncomfort? And they don't care. They're trying to make a point. Which is also why my heart breaks for people in the name of God who will try to humiliate someone else. I'm just telling you, I remember watching the news one day, and there was this guy, he had this different idea, and this other guy was trying to win the argument. And he was saying, let me show you this verse. And then the whole time I'm thinking, no, get him off the TV. He doesn't represent me. Jesus did not condone this woman's sin, but he didn't want to condemn this woman either. Here's what the religious people are going to go. They're going to say, okay, hey, Jesus, this woman caught in the act of adultery, the Bible says, the Old Testament law says she should be stoned. What do you say? So now, they think he's in a rock and a hard place. Because if he really does believe the law, then he must hold the law. And Jesus calmly is not going to argue with what they said. But here's what he does say. And I'm just paraphrasing. He says, let the person without sin cast the first stone. And I can imagine in that moment, for the first time, these religious people see their sin for what it is. And what they do is they all drop their stones and they walk away. And then this woman is left with Jesus. Now, I have to ask you, what would be the most uncomfortable? An angry mob who wants to kill you for something that you knew that you were doing that was wrong? Or is it standing there with Jesus, the perfect image of holiness and purity? He never sinned one time. For me, it's standing right there with Jesus. And I imagine this woman who's filled with shame and awkwardness and embarrassment and just nothing to say. I imagine she's standing there with Jesus, and Jesus is going to say, where are your accusers? And here's what Jesus says to this woman. He says, listen, they're not anywhere, and I don't condemn you, but go your way and sin no more. Let me just say this. If you are committing sin right now, if you are doing something that violates Scripture, God is not okay with it. He's not. It breaks his heart. But here's what you also need to know. He loves you, and he wants to help you move out of that, and he doesn't want to condemn you. Here's what I love about the story is Jesus is going to release this woman from sin. And I imagine when she gets up from that moment, the reason that she doesn't sin is not because she's scared, it's because she received unprecedented grace from God. It's an amazing story. But for most of us, when we sin, the reason why it's so hard for us to get up is we have these thoughts that go through our mind. And I think it's from the evil one. The first thought that goes through, at least my mind, is this thought that goes like this: how could I do that? How could I do that? How could I? I was doing so good. I was making so much profit. How could I do that? And you fill in what that is for you. How could I one beer turned into 2, 3, 4, 5 beers? How could I go over there again? How could I say that again? How could I let myself go to that place? How could I do that? But then here's the second thought, and it gets a little darker. Is the second thought that goes like this: I'll never change. I'll never change. My dad was like this. His dad was like this. This pattern cannot be broken. This is who I am. I cannot get better. Some of you are feeling that right now. I'll never change. I'll never break through. And so what you do is you lower your standards to your current reality instead of rising to what God has called you to. But then here's the last one. It goes like this: how could God ever love somebody like me? How could God love somebody like me who mess up, who doesn't always tell the truth, who doesn't always live up to what they've committed to? How could God love somebody like me? See, this is why it's so difficult to deal with failure alone. As we start answering those questions, he can't. He won't. And this is going to be my reality. And that's why the writer of Ecclesiastes says, pity anyone who falls and there's no one to pick them up. That takes me back to the 80s. Any of you guys remember the 80s? Anybody, were you around in the 80s? Now, some of you were around in the 80s, and I could tell because you still got that 80s hairdo. But anyway, here's That's an email. Anyway, in the 80s, there was a guy by the name of Mr. T. You guys remember Mr. T? Here's a picture of my man, Mr. T, right here. That's called Bling That'll Make You Sing right there. But anyway, Mr. T, he was famous for a phrase that went like this. He said, I pity the fool. Pity the fool. I pity the person who's about to get into a conflict with me. And he's obviously being sarcastic. But the writer of Ecclesiastes is saying, with a broken heart and a contrite spirit, I pity the person who has to walk through, live through, battle through the feelings of condemnation alone. He says, listen, we need each other. I want to tell you why I'm standing here today. I've been mentored by God's grace by some really well-known pastors. And if I were to say their names, some of you have been around church for a long time, you might think, okay, that guy has a pretty decent, impressive resume. But that's not why I'm standing here. The reason I'm standing here is because I can remember in the early stages of me starting to walk with God, a guy by the name of Blake Boudreaux coming alongside me and saying, Keith, you can do this. And I can remember as a little teenager in youth group, I would go to youth group and I would have a moment with God, and then I would get around my friends, and then I would have that same process where I would fail, and I would think, how could I do that? I'll never change. And how could God love me? And I can remember Blake Boudreaux saying, Keith, you can do this. Keith, you're not what you've done. There's greatness in you. Look at me, son. God's got a calling on your life. I think about a pastor named Pastor Adam McCain. Most of you never heard of him. He was my youth pastor. And I can remember one time calling him on the phone, said, Pastor Adam, oh my gosh, you'll never believe what I said, what I did. And I remember him speaking scripture in my life and said, Keith, you can do this. It was those people who helped me and helped me grow. Because here's the last thing that the writer of Ecclesiastes is going to say. By the time you get to verse 12, he says, everybody deals with battles. One person can easily be overtaken. But he says, two people together, they can stand, they can handle it, they can deal with it. The last thing he says that when you don't have anybody in your life, it makes the battles of life harder. It makes the battles of life harder. The truth about life is that it's full of blessings and battles. And some of you came to church today and you're in the midst of a battle. And here's what I want to say, you don't have to go through that battle alone. Some of you have a battle with your budget. Some of you have a battle with anxiety. Some of you have a battle with an addiction. You don't have to battle that alone. You know, let me stop preaching for a moment and just share my heart as a pastor. What my passion is, what my desire is, I would love for this church to be filled with leaders and people who reflect the light of Jesus. But even more than that, what I long to lead and pastor is a church where nobody suffers in silence, where everybody has a Blake Boudreaux, where everybody has somebody who can journey with them when life gets hard, when they're in the midst of the ditch and they're trying to pick themselves up, that there's a phone call that you can make where somebody says, hey, there's hope and there's a light on to help you get through this battle.
Thank you for listening to the Thornapple Valley Church podcast. If you found this message encouraging, we invite you to share it. For more information, visit tbcweb.com.